Hello, everyone. Great to have a really big crowd here today. My name is Owen O'Neill. I'm Professor in Environmental Policy and Director of the Earth Institute. We seek to promote interdisciplinary environmental, climate and sustainability research in UCD. A really good audience here from a diverse range of backgrounds. So we have civil and public servants across government departments, state agencies, industry, farm organisations, think tanks, academia, politics and more. So you're all very welcome here this afternoon. It's the final session in our Adapt for the Future seminar series, an initiative designed to connect research, policy and practice. We've ran a number of events over the last while: coastal ecosystems, barriers to climate action, resilience in transport, managing our heritage, and then today we're moving on to the Nature Restoration Plan. So special thanks to the Earth Institute Biodiversity team, co-chaired by Adam Kane and Dara Stanley, who got the ball rolling around an event focused on this National Restoration Plan. Tracks as a mandatory transformative framework to tackle biodiversity loss, enhance climate change resilience and restore essential habitats. So today we'll hear all about the context, process and content of Ireland's draft National Restoration Plan from people involved in that process itself. So in anticipation, a big thank you to all the contributors: David Fenner, Dr. Lisa Sheenan, Associate Professor Evie Nihuluan, Professor Taz Crow, and with this session being chaired now by Associate Professor Dara Stanley, I'd like to thank Antonio Soler and the Earth Institute team for all the arrangements today. So now I'll just introduce Dara. So Dr. Dara Stanley is an Associate Professor in Applied Entomology in the School of Agriculture and Food Science and the Earth Institute at UCD. Her broad research interests span biodiversity, ecology, conservation and sustainable agriculture, with a special focus on pollinating insects and plants. She currently leads a research team investigating questions around plant and pollinator ecology, conservation, public perceptions and interactions with pesticide use and climate. She's co-chair of the Earth Institute Biodiversity Research Team, founding member of the Irish Pollinator Research Network and an active member of the All-Ireland Climate and Biodiversity Research Network, British Ecological Society and Royal Entomological Society. So I'll hand over now to Dara, who'll introduce our various speakers. So
thanks, Owen. And welcome everyone. It's great to see so many people here interested in talking about Ireland's Nature Restoration Plan. So hopefully, as you're all aware, it's a great time of year for nature. The trees are getting their leaves, flowers are coming into bloom, chicks are fledging, bumblebees are looking for their nests. So it's a lovely time to look at and appreciate nature, but it's also a great time of year to think about the importance of nature and what nature does for us. So nature is hugely important for our existence. Nature provides us with clean air, clean water, raw materials, food. It helps us to respond to environmental challenges, things like climate change and flooding. Nature is also the foundation of the world's economy. And it's also really important for us as humans in terms of our well-being, in terms of our mental health, in terms of culture, in terms of spirituality. But unfortunately, it's not all good news when it comes to nature, so much so that many people consider us now to be in a biodiversity crisis. When we look at an EU level, we know that 80% of protected habitats in the EU are in unfavourable status. In Ireland, that rises to 90%, half of which are still in decline in terms of their quality. We also know that 30% of our bumblebees, 20% of our butterflies are threatened with extinction. And we know from our national monitoring schemes that many species across the board are showing declines. So concerns around this led to our own government in Ireland declaring a national biodiversity emergency in 2019. So it's with this backdrop that the EU Nature Restoration Regulation, commonly known as EU Nature Restoration Law, came into being. Although controversial in its inception, it was adopted in 2024, and it has an overarching aim of restoring 20% of the EU's degraded ecosystems by 2030, and all of them by 2050. So it has the potential to be a game changer for nature and biodiversity in the EU, ensuring that the provision of ecosystem services is maintained into the future. And it's really exciting because it's shifting the dial from nature conservation towards nature restoration. So as a researcher, a lot of my researchers focuses on pollinating insects, and under the Nature Restoration Law, there's a few particular target groups or target areas, and one of them is around insect pollinators. And pollinators are very important in the production of our food and also in the health of our natural ecosystems. But to date, pollinators have had no specific legal protection within the EU. In Ireland, we have one legally protected insect, and that is the marsh fritillary butterfly. So it's really exciting to see that there now is the legal backing for pollinator conservation and pollinator restoration across Europe. So under the law, we have to reverse pollination decline by 2030, thereafter having an increasing trend. And it also provides the provision, gives the provision for an EU-wide pollinator monitoring scheme using a common methodology. So for the first time, we're actually going to know what's happening with EU pollinators using consistent methods across all of the EU. So in response to the EU nature restoration law, each member state has to create a national nature restoration plan. And we're here today to talk about the nature restoration plan for Ireland. So the nature restoration plan will be coming up for public consultation, David tells me, at the end of May. So what we really hope will happen today is that everyone in this room will get an introduction to the nature restoration plan, where it's come from, how it's come about, and that will put us all in an excellent position to respond to this public consultation when it opens. So we're really delighted to have 4 speakers today that have been involved in various aspects of the development of Ireland's nature restoration plan. And the way the format is going to be that we'll have a short presentation for each of them, from each of them. And after that, we will open up to a general discussion and Q&A from the audience. So what I'll do is I think I'll introduce all 4 speakers together, and then we'll be able to roll through the presentations from there. So yeah, we're delighted to have, first of all, Dr. David Fenner with us. He's an Assistant Principal Officer in the International and EU Affairs Directorate of the MPWS, and he's responsible for coordinating the development of the Nature Restoration Plan. And he's going to give us an introduction to Ireland's Nature Restoration Plan. Then we have Lisa Sheehan, who's an Assistant Professor in Banking and Finance at UCD, and she's a funded investigator under the Climate Plus Co-Centre, where she leads a team analysing the socio-economic costs and benefits of restoration measures for the MPWS to inform the Nature Restoration Plan. She also has an interest in the legal background, so she's going to tell us a little bit about the legal background to the Nature Restoration Plan and the socio-economic costs and benefits work that she's been doing. Then we have Dr. Aoibhinn Ní Súilleabháin, who's an Associate Professor in the School of STEM Education, Innovation and Global Studies at DCU. She is former Chair of Ireland's Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss, and she's now Chair of the Independent Advisory Committee on Nature Restoration, whose work will conclude with Ireland's submission of the Nature Restoration Plan in September. So she's going to tell us about the stakeholder engagement process and work of the Independent Advisory Committee with regards to the Nature Restoration Plan. Finally, we have Professor Tasman Crowe, who is Vice President for Sustainability at UCD. He's Chair of Ireland's National Biodiversity Forum, and he's a member of the Independent Advisory Committee for Nature Restoration alongside Aoibhinn. And he also co-chairs an advisory group to government on the expansion of Ireland's network of marine protected areas. So Taz is going to talk about other ongoing policy initiatives, including marine protected areas, within the context of the Nature Restoration Plan. So without further ado, I'm going to invite David to come up and give us our first presentation. So thank you, David.
Yeah, so this presentation, bear with me, folks, it can take an hour. Sometimes we do this for various formats. So I will try and condense it into the absolute bare minimum for 9 minutes. I will jump over 1 or 2 things, and if there are questions on it afterwards, I'm happy to take those in session. So without further ado, it's working. Here we go. Just to give you an overview, there we go. This, I think, is a good representation of it. So the nature restoration law itself is extremely broad. It covers a whole range of different ecosystems. You can see them there. And what it does is it introduces, just to make it extra simple, it introduces a series of very different types of targets for different types of ecosystems. The pollinators target was mentioned as well. You can see them there, Article 10. But the really challenging ones are at the beginning there, and they're circled there in red. And that concerns protected habitats, both in the terrestrial and the marine space. And that borrows very heavily, and I have them down there in the bottom, from the Habitats Directive, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and the Birds Directive. So it basically takes these existing provisions and puts them into a kind of legally binding target format. So that's what we have baked into the nature restoration law. What we have here in particular is area-based targets. So to give an example, it's all about assessing what the area of a particular habitat is that's not in good condition, and then restoring a certain percentage of that, be it 30% to 2030, 60% to 2040, and 90% at least by 2050. It's worth noting, though, that the restoration here, what it means is not actually restoring that area, but putting measures in place. So it's kind of an effort-based system that we have under the NRL. That's key to note. We have different types of targets. So those are the kind of area-based ones. They're the biggest. And then if you move over, I have another one there. River connectivity is a good example. So that borrows very heavily from the Water Framework Directive. But what it's really all about is basically free-flowing rivers and then their connected floodplains, as in enhancing the biodiversity there. There is no national target here, though. So while there's an EU target of 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers, we don't have a national target. So what it becomes about instead is putting in place a kind of system that allows us to assess the extent of our free-flowing rivers, which is something that we don't necessarily have at the moment, determining what barriers should be removed or mitigated, and then determining what can we do for floodplains and what floodplains are connected, so a kind of catchment-based approach. Once again, it picks up on the Water Framework Directive, so some of that work has been done. What we have to do in the NRP is to try and think all of those elements together. There's other key articles in there. Some of those will have been in the negotiations, or the inception phase was mentioned earlier, and that was particularly relevant, I suppose, for the agricultural ecosystems, where there's a lot of talk about the kind of rewetting element, which is baked into Article 11. Essentially, once again here, it's all about rewetting a certain small percentage of agricultural peatlands, and then restoring the rest. So the idea that we would all be kind of farming water buffalo and planting cranberries or something is not really baked into this article. What it's about, once again, is capitalizing on a lot of the stuff that we're doing already, either be it part of the EDRIS program or be it part of other programs like Wild Atlantic Nature, which are already delivering on the ground for restoring peatlands. So you see it at the bottom there. Our job at the moment is to draft a national restoration plan. Now, it's a draft this year because it's a multi-phased approach, and I'll talk about that in just one second. In the format of a template that the Commission has published. They published this last year, so we have to basically insert all the information that we are generating through our process, and I'll give you a sense of the process in a second, and put it into this template to specify how we're going to deliver on our targets to 2030, 2040, and 2050. So once again, it's a rolling system. We have to basically determine measures, determine how effective they are, and then assess again how effective they were in 2040 and 2050, because once again, it's all about, or the requirement of the NRL is about putting measures in place as opposed to restoring something by a certain date. The idea is here to cater for the fact that restoring nature is not a simple process, and it's not a linear process either. So each habitat, each species responds differently, and even within habitats and species groups, depending on the site, the response will be different. So what the plan needs to do, and I said in the interest of keeping this quick, I will skip through some of this stuff. Essentially, I suppose setting a baseline is absolutely critical. We need to, once again, I mentioned this already, set the targets. I talked about the kind of 2040, 2050 approach. There's reviews baked in. There's one in 2032 and then 2042. So those will be, once again, assessing what have we achieved, what went wrong, what did not happen in the way that we expected it to, and what do we need to do differently. And then the same in 2042. A lot of quantification and mapping work still needs to be done. So the geospatial data kind of extent that we have in Ireland is not as good as we might want it to be. So a lot of work still needs to be done, which is why, once again, it will be an iterative process. And a really, really critical part of this, because it's this kind of rolling, kind of iterative approach, is the monitoring element of it. We have to ensure, be it for the pollinators we mentioned earlier, be it for the condition of our habitats, and in particular in the marine space, which is a really, really challenging space because it's so vast, which is not something I suppose I need to tell this audience, but we have to make sure that we monitor properly, not just what the condition is, but also how things react to restoration measures that are put in place. There's a broader context to the plan as well, which is all about how the plan interacts with other policies, and I won't go into this in great detail, but basically the The idea is that the plan is kind of embedded in a broader policy context, and some of the policies you'll see there you'll be familiar with, so whether it be energy or climate, or the common fisheries policy and the common agricultural policy at EU level. We have to determine how they interact, and that is part of what will go into the plan as well. And then there's another piece about determining both what are the impacts of the plan, and then what are the benefits of the plan. And once again mirrored onto all those different policy areas and across the country. That is a challenging thing to do, I suppose, because it's such an iterative process, and it's a bit of a chicken and an egg problem as well, because if you haven't agreed all your measures yet and you haven't determined whether those measures are appropriate, etc., it's hard to determine what the impacts are. So this once again will be a rolling iterative process. This is the structure that we put in place, and I won't actually go through this because I know we have a couple of speakers who will talk about the most important parts of that. I will focus on the interdepartmental working groups, which is what I manage. We have a whole series of them. I will focus on one of the key articles, and I'll just do this in an absolute nutshell, but once again, in the interest of keeping this short. And that is one of the biggest one. I talked earlier about the whole area-based targets piece. Article 4 concerns all the terrestrial, coastal, and freshwater habitats. And there's 59 listed in the annex of the Habitats Directive. I mentioned earlier as well that once again, the NRL borrows very heavily from existing legislation, including the Habitats Directive. So you can see the different groups here. Our job is to essentially determine what is the area that's not in good condition. As you're all aware, there is reporting under the Habitats Directive, and the 90% that was mentioned earlier is the area that is not in good condition. So that will be the total area. That doesn't mean that all the habitats are not in good condition, because obviously some habitats are much larger than others. This concerns the area. We have to then ensure that we determine where of those habitats should we put measures in place. And you can see the percentages there that we have to do this for. And then there are re-establishment measures as well. So we have the restoration of condition, and the second element is restoring the favorable reference area, which is the minimum amount of area that's required for a habitat to be self-sustaining. So for that, we also have percentage restoration elements or re-establishment targets, and you can see them there as well. So our job is basically to break that down. There's another element in Article 4 as well, because the pollinators were mentioned earlier, and I think there was a reference to the birds as well. And of course, we have to put restoration measures in place as well for species. This is it's linked to habitats again. So it's all about putting measures in place that improve the quality and the quantity of their habitats. Once again, it's about ensuring that they can be self-sustaining over time. So what we've been doing is we've been quantifying those targets based once again on existing reporting and existing monitoring. You can see all the references there. These are the different habitats and the different species that fall under the NRL, just for reference. And we've been using obviously reporting under the Birds Directive as well to do that same piece. And then in terms of measures, it's very challenging. I mentioned this earlier, this kind of iterative piece. And of course, we have to go all across government to all the various departments and agencies who are involved in this. The breadth is mind-boggling. And that's why we have these interdepartmental working groups as well. But we basically are attempting to determine as a first step, I suppose, or we've kind of determined all the measures that are already being delivered, which was already a challenge because that knowledge was not necessarily there. And then determining, well, what else needs to be done? And then additional measures have been added in. And here are a few of examples of them, which I once again won't go into. But yeah, this is maybe the most important piece. This is the current timeline. So of course, this kind of project, this kind of plan needs an appropriate assessment, a strategic environmental assessment, and a strategic flood risk assessment. We've started that process. And as part of this process, there's obviously consultations with the statutory consultees, but there's also a public consultation. The first one will commence the week of the 25th of May. It's 4 weeks, which I know, and we've heard this repeatedly, and people are absolutely right to say this is very short. Totally agree. Our challenge is that we have such tight deadlines to deliver a draft plan that that's the maximum amount of time that we could make for this first phase. But this is just a draft at this stage. So in a way, it's all about showing people what needs to be done under the NRL, giving people a sense of this is the kind of thing that needs to be done. This is the extent of the work. This is the extent of the challenge as well. And there will be a second phase, you can see it there, because we still have a year after we submit the draft plan to the Commission to finalize the plan before it gets published in September 2027. So you see that there. So that is a typo indeed, yeah, eagle eyes, fair juice. So yeah, absolutely. There will be a second public consultation in May to June 2027. We're hoping to maximize this in terms of the time available. And we're currently working with the consultants who are doing the AA and SEA process for us to hopefully even draw that out a bit more, as much as we possibly can, to give more time to public consultation. And that's it, basically, in a nutshell.
Just before we start, just to kind of make clear my role in this, because I know it can get confusing because I work for UCD, but as part of my job, I'm also a funded investigator in the co-centre for Climate plus Biodiversity plus Water. And we have a policy response unit that responded to the tender that the MPWS put out in order to find researchers to provide an evidence base for the NRP. So that's kind of where I come into this work. So we're working closely with David and with the MPWS to provide the evidence base for the plan. And in this presentation, I'm going to try and very quickly, because I know I only have 9 minutes, Dara, do two things. So we're going to kind of zoom out. I'm going to talk about the legal context in terms of the regulation, what it requires and what that means for Ireland, and then zoom in and give you a flavour of exactly the work that we've been doing for the NRP. So our team works on the socioeconomic analysis. So I'll start. I won't spend too long on this. Dara already outlined, the need for this, but I do think it's important to take a step back. Why are we doing this at all? So in terms of planetary boundaries, we have already, in terms of biosphere integrity, we're in the high risk zone and land system change has passed beyond safe boundaries. So this is not about gradual degradation anymore. We are already operating outside of a safe ecological space. And that itself was one of the main drivers at the EU level for, moving beyond this passive conservation to active large-scale restoration. And the regulation is the EU's first attempt at this. So just as Dara also pointed out, regulation and law, the two terms are used interchangeably. Officially, it is an EU regulation, and that means that it's directly applicable to all member states without any need for national transposition. So it's not any weaker than a law, but we hear kind of both terms interchangeably, which is fine. So in terms of the political and the legislative timeline, we'll go back quickly to May of 2020. So that was when the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030 was published. And this recognised that existing conservation efforts were insufficient and highlighted a need for regulated, legally binding restoration. So in 2022, the Commission proposal, it kicked off a complex and at times highly controversial and highly contested negotiation process across member states with the European Parliament. And at times it looked like it wasn't going to get across the line at all. So it was taken off the table completely in April 2024. But as we know, of course, it did eventually get through later that year. But, it came through narrowly. And you can see, maybe you can't see, but, there were a few states that obviously voted against it. So where are we now? You remember from David's timeline, and why we're here today, preparing the NRP draft for September 2026. So the key elements of the regulation itself. So at its core, it establishes those legally binding restoration obligations across the EU. And these are the headline targets, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. The 20% of EU land and sea by 2030 and all ecosystems in need by 2050. But apart from those high-level targets, it also introduces specific measurable obligations at the ecosystem level. So Dara discussed pollinator recovery. There's also urban green space targets, and David mentioned the free-flowing rivers. And again, why we're here today, a key part of it is the NRPs. So as I said, it represents the EU's first restoration-focused legal framework, shifting away from that passive conservation to active ecological recovery. But we know that the EU, even though they have set these targets, they do not restore nature directly. Member states do. What does it mean for Ireland? Well, again, why we are here today, and I won't go into it as David already outlined what the NRP involves. So at this point, I want to transition from that very quick kind of legal story to the work that we've been doing to support the NRP. But first, I think it's useful to look at what the regulation covers in terms of ecological scope. So here we have habitat groups and ecosystems. You can see this is very broad. It covers a lot. So that moves then in terms of how it is organized in the regulation, in terms of the legal structure. So here we have the ecosystems groups from the previous slide, organized according to terrestrial and freshwater, marine and other systems. And this is how they are then organized in the regulation itself. So you can see that the regulation is structured around a relatively small number of core articles. And at the top there, Article 4, that's where the main quantified restoration targets sit. And when we, as a team, were performing our socioeconomic analysis, we started with Article 4 because the most data were available for that. Also, just a quick note that the same ecosystems can appear under multiple articles depending on whether you're focusing on habitat restoration or ecosystem performance and indicators. But I think just, you know, when we're talking about all this, it's useful to get into our heads, like how do the habitat groups actually sit within the articles? So this brings me to the work that we have been doing to support the NRP. So the work package that I have been working on, the aim is to provide the socioeconomic and financial evidence base for the plan. So to ensure that the measures under the regulation are supported by credible cost, benefit and financing analysis. And our work is structured around three main tasks. I'll focus mostly on the first one today, but I will briefly touch on 2 and 3. So the first one is the socioeconomic analysis. And then number 2 is, how can this be funded if we're looking at private investment? And number 3 then is to identify and evaluate environmentally harmful subsidies and fiscal support. So this is our research team. Again, this is through the co-centre, the Policy Response Unit. So we're across 3 universities, DCU, UCD and Queen's. And we have expertise, so in biological sciences, finance, economics and accounting. And we're working, like I said, in collaboration with the NPWS. So we have an awful lot of results. We have an awful lot of figures. So I'm going to I will put figures up, but I'm going to give you the key messages because I obviously don't have time to go through everything, but I want to give you a flavour of what we did. So task 1, the socioeconomic costs and benefits. I'll show you here for Article 4. Just some results. We did a bottom-up cost-benefit analysis. So we started at the habitat level, bottom-up, and then we scaled up to the national level. In terms of our scope, we were looking at 743,112 hectares of terrestrial, coastal and freshwater ecosystems divided between restoration and re-establishment. Our cost components, so we have 3 main categories: our one-off capital restoration works, our re-establishment costs, and then annual ongoing maintenance and monitoring. So here are just some indicative unit cost ranges. So these are in ranges, and you're going to see some of the ranges are very wide because we have so many different ecosystems within those. We have some headline cost estimates here. So from 2024 to 2050, our base case is around 5.7 billion in terms of the cost. But we've done, like I said, we have a lot of figures. We've done scenario analysis, sensitivity testing, phased in costs and things like that. So this is just to give you an idea. an indicative breakdown, it's almost 50-50 in terms of the costs between the restoration and reestablishment and those ongoing maintenance and monitoring costs. Okay, so I'll just talk through the benefits and then I'll finish. Had it like 8 minutes earlier. Okay, so the benefits, we divide these into carbon sequestration and ecosystem services. Again, you can see down here, very wide range because it varies by ecosystem types. The main point I want you to take away from this is that the total benefits substantially exceed the total costs over all scenarios assessed. I'll show you here, this is just a graph showing you the green are the benefits and the blue are the costs. And this is in line with emerging literature on the subject. And we've been speaking to other member states, particularly the Netherlands, they're finding the same here, that the benefits exceed the total costs. So very quickly, I'll just give you a flavour of the results for task 2. So this was to look at, okay, well, where can we, fund, how can we fund this in terms of if we look at private investment? So private biodiversity finance, it must be from a private origin, biodiversity intent and relevant for Ireland. That's our criteria. Here are just some figures again in terms of our base case for near term up to 2032, 300 to 600 million. Long term, this is more of an optimistic case, 1 to 2.5 billion. The key message from this task is that public finance remains essential, particularly for habits with weak or uncertain revenue potential and early stage or high risk restoration measures. Investors, they require that comfort, that blended finance approach in order to get them involved. Okay, one more slide. So task 3 is about identifying and evaluating environmentally harmful subsidies and fiscal supports that can conflict with the restoration objectives. So we have 2 categories: fossil fuel and other energy subsidies harmful to the environment. These are comparatively well defined and quantified, and then we have non-energy environmentally harmful subsidies. These are less well defined and likely to be more significant in some sectors. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry, Dara. Thank you.
Afternoon, everybody. I'm Evie Nihulawan, as Dara introduced earlier, and I didn't get to see David's or Lisa's slides, so maybe I can skip over some of my initial ones. But as Dara said, I had the privilege of chairing the Independent Advisory Committee on Nature Restoration. We have some members of that committee here today, which is wonderful, and I'll talk you through the work that we did over the last 15 months or so. And our recommendations report will be actually published tomorrow, which we didn't know when I said or when I was invited to do this. So this is all very timely because you'll see what I'll be talking about. You'll see that around tomorrow afternoon. As both Lisa and David said, and I think you've got a good understanding of that now, the regulation is the law for all of the 27 member states. It might be relevant to include here that while Lisa mentioned, at the time that this was going through the EU, there was a lot of controversy over it and a lot of maybe disagreement. But I do think it's important to reference here that at that time, the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss published their recommendations in 2023. And recommendation 8 from that was that Ireland take a leading role in passing the EU Nature Restoration Regulation, which I feel was taken to heart since all government MEPs voted for the regulation against the European counterparts, against the EPP and others. And so they voted to support that. So I just wanted to add that into that mix because the Citizens' Assembly, I feel, did add to the discussion that we're having today now around the EU Restoration Regulation. You know all this now. We have to put a draft plan in September 26. It's to be a whole of government, whole of society approach. And that's what government had stated. And we have all of these ecosystems that we have to have a look at. One thing that I learned from many of the things that I learned over the last 15 months is that our marine territory is not actually 10 times the size of our landmass. It's around 6 to 7. So all these little nuances. But I think I'll highlight a couple of them to you for 1 second, because I wanted to pull out elements that we're not really used to thinking about in Ireland. So on Article 8 is restoration of urban ecosystems. And I just wanted to put a little bit of a summary there over what it is. And while there's no strict targets, by 2030, we have to have no net loss in the national area of urban green space and urban tree canopy covers. This means we have to start looking at this and recording it. We haven't been doing that to date. And after 2030, we have to have increasing trends in urban green spaces and urban tree canopy covers. So not only is this something new that we have to look at, what I wanted to highlight from this is something that we learned from Lisa's presentation to the committee was that urban green spaces are not something that any private investor will look to do. And so this is something that we have to look towards in terms of public finances for the public good, because it is, if I take my education hat on for a second now, it's the kids in inner city Dublin, Cork, Limerick that are the least likely to have access to nature, not just high quality nature, just access to nature. And that impacts on their health, well-being and educational achievement. So, for example, as one obligation that Ireland now has to take, I would say let's focus on those urban areas where there is no green space or urban tree canopy cover and focus on those to have that increasing trend. So just wanted to add that piece in there. And also we had some discussion over Article 11. And while re-wetting kind of takes over a lot of the airtime on it, it's one aspect of it. It's an important aspect of it. We spent a lot of time talking about it, but it's one aspect because otherwise in Article 11, we have to look at identified levels of the common farmland bird index, so something we've been already looking at to increase that, and the grassland butterfly index there as well, along with high diversity landscapes, things that we are already recording. So while some of these targets seem quite enormous, particularly our forestry ones, others we are on the road, I would hope, to starting. So I do think there's great opportunity here now across different areas to have a look at it. David already showed you a diagram of this, but what Ireland has done is actually quite unique, I think, in terms of what other member states have done, in that an independent advisory committee was established, and the minister's team is not here, so I'll make reference to the former minister who established it, who's sitting at the back of the room, current Senator Malcolm Noonan, put together an independent advisory committee to try and get a range of stakeholders in a room together to come to an agreement about what Ireland's nature restoration plan should look like. Now, that committee was bigger than initially conceived, and we ended up with a committee of 12, but it was great because we had farmers, fishermen, forestry, local authorities, environmental groups, state agencies and scientists involved in that committee. And there was great engagement over 15 months where we came up with our recommendations that will be published tomorrow. And our conversations and our work was informed by the presentations and reports that we got from the interdepartmental working groups that David mentioned, so across departments and state agencies that was kind of working on our targets, but also stakeholder engagement that was done quite extensively, and I'll talk about that now for a second. So this was the Independent Advisory Committee on Nature Restoration. We didn't do a good job photographing our work all the time, so not everybody is photographed here, but as you can see from the list there, a very expansive group, and a group that didn't always agree, and yet we found agreement on very many things, which I think is something really important to take from this. And I think it probably draws on, the Danes had a green tripartite where it was scientists, farmers and environmentalists who were put into a room for 6 months to come up with something they would do for carbon credits. And that passed in their parliament a number of years ago. And I feel like this is kind of building on that, you know, when you allow people time to talk, they can find a nuance and find agreement. So the stakeholder engagement that fed into the Independent Advisory Committee consisted of two formats, the leaders forums and the community conversations. David's already shown you that we had to do stakeholder engagement because it's in the legal requirements, so I don't need to go into it here. But in terms of designing the leaders forums, in the committee, we wanted to design something where people really felt included, respected and listened to, that they felt that they were actually part of the evolving work of the plan and the recommendations of the committee for that plan, and trust that this was not a tick box exercise, because a lot of people felt that they'd been involved in very many environmental actions before, but they didn't really feel like they had been listened to. And so we wanted something that was something they came out feeling, okay, well, at least I got to say my bit. And then building on the Citizens' Assembly, I was really hopeful that we could incorporate principles of deliberative democracy for people who were already working in the area. So the leaders' forums were including people who were already working in the fields of nature and who would be impacted by the nature restoration regulation. So it was people who already had skin in the game. So we did them in terms of roundtable discussions with a professional facilitator and a professional note taker at every table, very similar to the Citizens' Assembly. All the conversations were recorded and summarised, and every single one of those reports was then made available online, and the committee read through them to inform our discussions then as well. And so it was just a format where people could come together to listen to each other. And I have some lovely anecdotal evidence where I had a text from a farmer after our very first one to say it was such a pleasure to sit at a table who care as much about nature as I do. Or have somebody from the legal profession come up and go, I was sitting with two farmers and my God, are they passionate about this? I wasn't expecting that. And so just a demonstration that when you bring people into the room and when you have people of differing opinions at the same table talking to each other for a day, they really find some middle ground. They mightn't always go away and agree with each other, but they might respect each other a little more because they have listened to it. And every one of these meetings, we presented them to say, listen, you are here now, so we hope that you will come with this with some openness, fairness, respect the equality of voice among all members, and we'll work efficiently and collegiately with everybody in attendance. And if you want to look at any of the reports, they're all available on restorenature.ie in a long format, recording the conversations overall, and then an executive summary that is slightly shorter to summarise all those conversations. So they were one thing that fed into the work of the Independent Advisory Committee. And the other then were the community conversations, which were members of the general public and anyone else really that wanted to get involved in these conversations. They were held across the country. There were some online to facilitate people who maybe couldn't attend in person, some through Gaeilge and Osperla as well. And I do know that there were people from the islands who were represented in the Gaeltacht ones and things like that. We had ones involving youth, involving travellers. There was one in the Mart in Ballina. So it was really trying to get in that kind of cohesive mix of people across the country, inner city, rural, etc. So over 536 members of the public contributed to the community conversations, and that report is also online, and you might want to have a look at it because they synthesized reports from all of those different meetings into one big report, and that work was undertaken by ACT and Home Tree together, and it's a lovely piece of work because they have threaded through it quotes from people who participated in those community conversations. And that's just some photographs. They often went on a nature walk beforehand. So intergenerational as well, as you can see there. One thing that really came out of the community conversations was that overwhelming sense of loss, an ecological, a cultural and emotional. And that was something that for me, you'll have to ask the other committee members what they thought of it. But for me, that kind of hit home that there's I feel a really prominent sense of loss in terms of nature is part of heritage. It's not just part of infrastructure or just lovely to have around. It is part of who we are in Ireland. It's deeply linked with our language and our culture. And the fact that we're losing it isn't good enough. That's really what came across to me from the community conversations. And because I would love to always have my education hat on as an academic, and you're telling me I have one more minute, this is the most important thing for me, is that if we continue this is very difficult to see. So what I'll show is the circle on the left is basically talking about there's a very limited teaching of plant biology at school. Colleagues of mine have done research to demonstrate that even in the junior cycle, there's less and less about plants, almost nothing about insects. So biology is being really honed into talking about plants or talking about animals. It's very anthropocentric. But that means there's fewer students going to plant-focused degrees. There's actually less botanical teaching happening at university. A lot of people are going down biotech routes. So we have fewer experts in plant biology and ecology. There's a shortage of ecologists out there. There's a shortage of foresters. This is impacting on the planning because there's less ecologists to look at plans that are coming through, etc. So then if we go over to the circle on the right, because there's fewer people with expert knowledge of plants, there's a lack of general public understanding in ecology in general. And then the decision makers, our elected representatives, often lack the knowledge themselves or the experts to ask. So we are in this cycle right now. And so some of the recommendations that we'll see tomorrow are focused on the education system and what we can be doing to just even impact this part. There's no point in having nature restoration target lists for 25 years if the next generation don't even know why it's important to do it. So ecology and ecological literacy should be part of the primary and secondary curricula. That's hot off the press before you read it tomorrow. We'll be launching this tomorrow, and it'll be on restorenature.ie. So I'm very happy to have questions and answer that. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to bring a salty perspective to the proceedings, and I think it's going to sit reasonably well within the framing that everyone else has given, amplifying some aspects and bringing something different as well. So, as Evie said, our sea area is about 7 times the land area and is one of the biggest maritime areas in the EU. It's home to a wonderful diversity of plants and animals and habitats, which are important in their own right, but also underpin important ecosystems. And those ecosystems are really pivotal for a wide range of our cultural and social and economic activity. And so there's a lot going on in the marine space in Ireland. I think for a lot of people, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, but for other people, it's their day-to-day lived experience. So it is a crowded space, though it may not seem so. It seems like such a vast resource, especially in the near-shore environment. And so there are a range of kind of approaches to trying to manage to conserve and maintain those ecosystems so they continue to support us into the future, while also continuing to allow the sectoral activities and the engagements that we all depend on. So what I wanted to do was just kind of highlight that kind of intersection of different policy initiatives that kind of David set the scene for in his presentation as well. So there are 3 big ones that are currently being rolled out into the marine environment. So planning for offshore renewable energy, the development of the nature restoration plan, and also the expansion of the network of marine protected areas. And just to make the point, you know, these need to coexist with a range of important sectoral activities, particularly fishing and aquaculture. They need to coexist with other policy instruments, and they are or will be brought together under the kind of overarching National Biodiversity Action Plan, which also incorporates the recommendations of that Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Laws. So I just wanted to kind of go through each of them very, very briefly and give a sense of them and then sort of distill out a couple of take-homes, I guess. So first of all, we have a process in place to identify the areas where we could locate 15 gigawatts worth of offshore renewable energy installation by 2040. And that's hard to understand what that means, but the area in which those installations can be placed are constrained by the water depth, by the wave heights, by distances from ports and so on. And so there is actually, they can't be placed in the whole strip of maritime areas. So there will be places where there will be definite kind of crowding and challenge to fit that in alongside these other activities. In terms of the nature restoration regulation, we've already heard about the kind of the categories of habitats. So there are 7 groups under Article 5, the marine ecosystems. 6 of them pretty much correspond to habitats listed in the Habitats Directive, and the other group, which is soft sediments shallower than 1,000 meters, reflects the broad-scale habitat types that are listed under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. And we also have that obligation in the marine environment to protect, to improve habitats that are needed for 22 named species. Again, there are legally binding targets that we need to hit, and those targets are different. So again, echoing the theme that David made clear, that different kind of habitats have different kinds of targets. The kind of group 1 to 6 ones that are kind of part of the Habitats Directive essentially follow the same model that David described, in terms of focusing in on the areas that are not in good condition and putting measures in place to cover 30% of those areas by 2030, 60% by 2040, 90% by 2050. But the group 7 it works differently. In this case, it's also to focus on areas that are not in good condition. But in this case, the percentage coverage of measures is actually to be determined by the individual member states. And the interim target is 2/3 of whatever the target you set was by 2040. And there's also recognition in the marine space and in the target setting that we still are lacking a lot of knowledge and information to help us inform the process. So there's also a set of targets that we have to meet in terms of our knowledge of the distribution and condition of those marine habitats. It's much less clear, I think, than in the terrestrial environment. So I don't want to dwell on this slide. I know time is tight. I just wanted to use that to emphasize the point that this is very much a work in progress. And I think that's a point that will have been emerging already. It's been very ably led in Ireland by Catherine Cronin and Rebecca Jeffries, who head up that interdepartmental working group. They're doing a phenomenal job. And I worked with Catherine in preparation for these slides. But, even, the restoration measures themselves will need to be developed, and it's likely that they'll mainly be passive measures, which means the removal of pressure, which will often mean the restriction or modification of fishing, for instance, right? So it's not necessarily an active restoration process of trying to restore the habitat. So I think that's useful to keep in mind. The other piece of context I wanted to provide, so this is another process, this is the one I'm most closely involved with, is to expand our network of marine protected areas, which currently stands at about 10% of that maritime area. But that's pretty much exclusively through designations under the EU directives, so the Natura 2000 sites. There's national legislation for the designation of marine protected areas in development, and it underwent a bit of a delay for a while there, but I'm pleased to say that it seems to be progressing now. It looks as though it will emerge quite soon, and that will enable us to combine national designations with the Natura sites to meet our commitment to a 30% coverage by 2030. But in the meantime, we've been actively working on interim ecological sensitivity analyses for a number of reasons. We've already completed ones in the Irish Sea and in the Celtic Sea, and we're working now on the Atlantic region. And the idea has been to help provide an interim indication of where marine protected areas might potentially go into the future to help with the ORE planning, for instance, and to underpin the processes that will flow once the legislation is in place as well. And so all of them have actually had an intersection with the ORE development, but this current one now, we've brought a much stronger connection with the Natura sites in collaboration with colleagues in the National Parks and Wildlife Service and the nature restoration elements. So we're looking to find the minimum footprint that addresses the objectives of all of these different directives and initiatives. We've established, for these sensitivity analyses, we established a rigorous, transparent process with clear criteria. It's evidence-based, it involves stakeholder engagement, though not as much as we plan to roll out into the future when we have more time to do it. But and ultimately, we collect all the information that's available about sectoral activity and about the features that are determined to be meriting protection at a national level. And we run conservation prioritization modeling, which enables us to identify areas from within which one could establish a network of marine protected areas to meet a given set of conservation targets. Right, so those areas on the left-hand panel that are dark green and that are surrounded by black lines, for the Celtic Sea, you could meet the kinds of targets that we're likely to set from within those. And the models, and you can change the model parameters and look at alternative configurations, and you can do that directly in real time with stakeholders around the table as well going forward. And the models have been set essentially to minimize disruption to existing or planned sectoral activity. So the panel on the right, you may be able to see the little blue polygons in the top right-hand corner. Those are the areas that were identified as suitable for offshore renewable energy, and there's very little overlap there. The purple, the intensity of purple in the background is the intensity of fishing activity. And again, you'll be able to see that the most intensely fished areas are avoided by these configurations of potential future marine protected areas. When we go to the next phase of combining these three sensitivity analyses and really exploring the locations and management plans for the national set of marine protected areas, there'll be much more international engagement than we've had time to really do properly as part of this process, partly for joined up thinking with our neighbouring maritime areas and in conservation terms. So for example, through the OSPAR Commission, which is kind of a regional body with that as one of its objectives. But on the right-hand side, those are the fisheries boxes, right? So the other point of intersection with our neighbours that's very important, both for marine protected areas and also for nature restoration, is that any management measures that you might take in our exclusive economic zone have to be taken in conjunction with the common fisheries policy with other member states and get sign off at an EU level. So that's going to be an important part of the process. And just to wrap up, this is my last slide. Just to say, to reiterate the kind of the stakeholder engagement that's been going on through all of these processes, in fact, has been and is continuing to do so. This happens to be the high level bullets that have come out from work that I've been doing with KPMG for the National Biodiversity Forum across the board, but the marine perspective of stakeholders that we engaged with, there were some common themes there. So the recognition that we do need healthy marine systems and if nothing else to underpin our sexual activities and our coastal communities. There's a recognition that public awareness remains low. We need to engage more to improve engagement. There's concern about this policy complexity. It creates confusion and might make it difficult for things to kind of land properly. There's an ask for greater coordination among state agencies and better collaboration with the marine sector, and the sense that collaborative approaches are what's really going to deliver the best outcome. So I'll end with that kind of sense that we really need this kind of evidence-based approach that also hinges very heavily on stakeholder engagement and bring a collaborative approach going forward to find the best solutions across this complex environment. So thanks very much.